Okay, well, welcome back. This is part 4, and now that we've established some important things both scripturally and historically, it's time to take a different route, not a totally different route, but just a different perspective, and to look at a pattern in how the Masoretic uses times and timelines and ages so that you can understand a very important point later with the biblical timeline. This is a very important topic so that we can get deeper into the biblical alterations of the timeline that the Masoretic text has. And you'll know what I mean by that in just a minute. The modern story of the Israelites in Egypt is that they were their slaves for 400 years, which isn't true. Of course, you've seen movies like, is it Ben-Hur, I think, or, I forget. I think it's Ben-Hur. Anyway, we've been slaves for 400 years, this kind of thing. This kind of stuff is Hollywood. It's not true. The Jews were not in Egypt for 400 years, certainly weren't enslaved for 400 years. So we want to expose the truth on this because it's going to expose a pattern of error throughout other places that leads to very consequential impacts on your eschatology. And again, you'll understand what I mean by all this. We're going to tie it all together. But the Masoretic text has changed times and dates in Genesis 11 with the genealogies of the patriarchs. And that has a very significant impact. You'll see what we mean. In this particular part, I want to look at Egypt and Canaan and the history involving that, and to show you why the Masoretic text is wrong and why it can't be right, and what that means for our understanding of other things, like with the biblical timeline. So, Exodus 12, verse 40. Let's go to ESV. Actually, you know what? Why don't we do a parallel so you can see the difference? Exodus 12, verse 40 in the ESV says, "The time that the people of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years." Okay? Septuagint. "And the sojourning of the children of Israel, while they sojourned in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, was 430 years. So one is telling you they lived in Egypt for 430 years. The other one is telling you the sojourning period of Canaan and Egypt total was 430 years. Now, let's see what the Samaritan... Oh, goodness. Some of these windows are so tricky to do. Okay, there it is. Sometimes when you have so many tabs, it's like impossible to find the tab you're looking at. Anyway, this is the Samaritan Pentateuch. This is from stepbible.org. Let's read. Zoom out a little bit, please. Okay. The Samaritan Pentateuch reads, quote, "Now the sojourning of the children of Israel and of their fathers in the land of Canaan, in the land of Egypt, was 430 years. So it agrees with the Septuagint. The Alexandrine copy of the Septuagint has the same reading, and the same statement is made by the Apostle Paul in Galatians 3, verse 17. We're going to look at all of this, but this is just kind of a nice little introduction to the whole topic. Who reckons from the promise made to Abraham to the giving of the law. That these three witnesses have the truth, meaning Samaritan Pentateuch, Septuagint, and Paul. The chronology itself proves, for it is evident that the descendants of Israel did not dwell 430 years in Egypt, while it is equally evident that the period from Abraham's entry into Canaan to the Exodus is exactly that number. Thus, from Abraham's entrance into the promised land to the birth of Isaac was 25 years. Isaac was 60 at the birth of Jacob. Jacob was 130 at his going into Egypt, where he and his children continued 215 years more, making the whole 430 years. See Kennicott's dissertation on the Hebrew text. We're going to break this down in just a second. I just want to show you what the issue is. There's three witnesses that agree. Septuagint, Paul, and Samaritan Pentateuch. They all agree. But now let's go back to Paul and see what he says. So this is Galatians 3:16, 17 through 17. Now the promise is made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say and to offsprings, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. There are no promises, folks, to anybody outside of Jesus Christ. So all these dispensationalists that insist that the Jews have this and the Jews have... No, they don't. They have Christ. If they don't accept Christ, there's nothing. You will get the lake of fire is what you'll get. Verse 17. This is what I mean. The law which came 430 years afterward does not annul a covenant previously ratified by God, so as to make the promise void. Now, I wonder how the KJV has it versed. So now, verse 16, now Abraham and his seed were the promises made. So the promises were made to Abraham. Verse 17 says, and this I say that the covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after. After what? After the promises that were made. So Paul in verse 3, in 16 through 17, in Galatians 3, is reckoning the 430-year period from the beginning of the promises, not from when they came to Egypt. Do you see the error in the Masoretic text? Very important. So let's put it together, a couple more important details. Exodus 7, verse 7. Let's do ESV, because these things are correct even in the ESV. Now Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. So when the Exodus happened and Moses left Egypt, he was 80. Exodus 6, verse 20. A little bit before that. Amram took as his wife Jochebed, his father's sister, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. The years of the life of Amram were 137 years. So Moses' father was 137. He lived to be 137 years old. Okay, keep this in mind. We're going to all add it up in just a second. Exodus 6, verse 18. So a couple verses before that. This is Moses' grandfather. The sons of Kohath, Amram, Izrah, Hebron, and Uzziel. The years of the life of Kohath, which was Moses' grandfather, Amram's father, was 133 years. Okay, Genesis 46, verse 11. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. So Kohath, Moses' grandfather, was from the tribe of Levi. And verse 26 of the same chapter, all the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt, who were his own descendants, not including Jacob's wives, were 66 persons in all. Keep this in mind because this is actually not the same number according to the Septuagint. In fact, let's see. Does it say? Oh no, maybe I'm thinking of something else. There's another thing that Stephen quotes, but something to do with people migrating from Israel into Egypt. Anyway, the point is, what is the point? Moses' grandfather was one of the people who went with Jacob to Egypt. Do you get it? So Jacob and his tribe, Moses' grandfather was one of the people that came to Egypt with Jacob. Moses' father was 137 years old. Moses' grandfather was 133 years old. Moses was 80 years old when he left Egypt. So if you add up all of this together, 133 plus 137, that's 270, plus 80, you get 350 years. So even if it's end to end, it's impossible for them to meet that criteria of 430 years in Egypt. Do you understand the problem? All of these ages give you maximum 350 years, assuming they came one after the other, meaning like if his grandfather had his father at 1 year old and then Moses was birthed right at 1 year old, like if the ages came one right after the other, but that's not the case. They usually had kids when they were like 20, 30, maybe even 40, who knows. They didn't have kids very early on when they were like 10, right? So the point is that it's even shorter than that. But if you were to add all these ages up, you have a less number than 430 years. So the Israelites couldn't have been in Egypt 430 years, as the Masoretic text says. It's wrong. The reality is that they were much less than 350 years because, again, Kohath was not a newborn when he came to Egypt with Jacob. He was, probably a couple of years. Who knows how old he was, doesn't say, but he wasn't a newborn. And Amram, Moses' father, probably had Moses at an average age. Again, just estimating based on other things, 20, 30 maybe. So all those differences reduce the number from 350 to probably like 300 years, the total that you could possibly have. Meaning there's no way that the Israelites could have been in Egypt for 430 years. The real timeline is as follows. Genesis 12, verse 3 through 7. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarah his wife and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions and that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. So Abraham receives a promise. He enters Canaan, and he was 75 years old when this happened. Now we know that Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old, meaning 25 years later. Genesis 21, verse 5. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him, meaning Abraham, 25 years after the promise, is when Isaac was born. Genesis 25, verse 26 tells us when Jacob was born. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So we know Isaac was 60 when Jacob was born. Genesis 47, verse 8 through 11 tells us that Jacob arrives in Egypt 130 years later. And Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How many are the days of the years of your life?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my sojourning are 430 years. Note the word sojourning here. "Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their sojourning." And Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from the presence of Pharaoh. And then Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. So Jacob, when they finally arrive in Egypt, Jacob was 130 years old. So now we can do some math. Well, okay, 25 years for the distance between the promise and Isaac being born. Then 60 years later, Jacob was born. Then 130 years later, Jacob arrives in Egypt with the crew. What do you get when you add 25 plus 60 plus 130? You get 215. 215 years pass from Abraham entering Canaan, getting the promise, to Israel arriving in Egypt. Very straightforward. 430 years minus 250 years of that sojourning around in Canaan and all the things that I just described, and you have only 215 years in Egypt possible. Josephus agrees with this, and we know Josephus is an accurate historian. This is from Antiquities of the Jews. I forget which chapter. Okay, here it is. This is chapter 15, section 2 of book 2, I believe. They left Egypt in the month of Xanthicus on the 15th day of the lunar month, 430 years after our forefather Abraham came into Canaan, but 215 years only after Jacob removed into Egypt. It was the 80th year of the age of Moses, and of that of Aaron 3 more. They also carried out the bones of Joseph with them, as he had charged his sons to do. So, does Josephus, who is a very well-known and respectable historian, agree with the Masoretic text or the Septuagint? He agrees with the Septuagint timing, because he reckons, just like Paul, the sojourning beginning from the time of the promise. The 430 years began with the promise, not with, being in Egypt. That's nonsense, because that's just not what happened. Now, there's another source that I'll cite, and you can look into this for yourself, named Patterns of Evidence. They do a great job. They're archaeologists. They have a lot of things they've produced. But one of the things they've produced is on the Exodus. And basically, to give you the long story short, they also confirm the Septuagint, because they basically realized that the arrival of the Israelites was around 1665 BC. The Exodus was around 1450 BC, meaning there's a difference of about 215 years between the time that the Israelites arrived in Egypt and the time that they left. So we have now Josephus, Paul, Samaritan Pentateuch, archaeological evidence all agree with the Septuagint, not the Masoretic text. Ironically, though, the Masoretic text contains the ages of Moses and his fathers, which refute itself. Do you get the point? When you add up what we did in the very beginning of this, if you add up just the ages of Moses, his father, and his grandfather, it's less than 430 years. So how could they possibly have lived in Egypt for 430 years? It's a mistake. Now, interesting tidbit going back to the people with the 70 people. In Acts 7, verse 14, just another example of, people citing the Septuagint and not the Masoretic text. Stephen's speech. And Joseph sent and summoned Jacob, his father, and all his kindred, 75 persons in all. Okay. Genesis 46, verse 27 says, and the sons of Joseph who were born unto him in Egypt were 2. All the persons of the house of Jacob who came into Egypt were 70. So this is the Masoretic text. But if we look, I wonder if it says, you see, the Septuagint says we're 75 souls. So Stephen is not wrong. He's citing the Septuagint. And how you know that is the number is being cited from the Septuagint. In Exodus 1, verse 5, it says, all the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. But this is Septuagint. But Joseph was in Egypt, and all the souls born of Jacob were 75. So the Septuagint is the one that Stephen is citing, and it's yet another proof that the Masoretic text is not accurate, but rather must be double-checked, especially when it comes to biblical timelines, numbers, prophecies concerning Christ. All of these things are suspect in the Masoretic text. Again, God preserves his word, and the elect will always find the truth. You don't need, the idea that, oh my gosh, maybe the Jews corrupted the Bible or the translations, now nobody can learn the truth. I don't believe in that. My point is, be a good researcher and understand that the KJV is not this book to put on a pedestal as if Jesus came down and wrote it himself. It's a translation. It's useful, and I've shown you in places where it does a better job than modern translations, for sure. But there's also a lot of places where it doesn't do a better job, and that's the narrow road, folks. Anyway, Stephen cites the Septuagint, not the Masoretic text. Back to the story. So the years of slavery were 215 years maximum. However, they're less than 215 years for several reasons. Out of the 215 years the Israelites were in Egypt, there are other things that need to be deducted. Exodus 1, verse 6 through 8, we see a couple of things very important. Let me just read this from ESV. Then Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. So they prospered after Joseph's death. They didn't get enslaved immediately. Verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to this people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. And so eventually a new king came along that didn't like what was going on. And that's when you started to have the oppression. So there was a lag time between Joseph dying, who had favor with all the Egyptian royalty, and this new king coming along and basically, making new policies to enslave the Israelites. Genesis 41, verse 46, tells us that Joseph was 30 years old when he entered Pharaoh's service. Joseph was 30 when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. So Joseph was 30 when he basically began his role as kind of like the vice regent type. We also know he had that vision of the 7 years of abundance, 7 years of famine. And 2 years into the famine, Joseph was basically when Joseph arrived in Egypt. Let's see, verse 45 through 6. Verse 45, chapter 45, verse 6. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. So Joseph was 39 when Israel arrived in Egypt. That's what I was trying to say. Meaning, so the 7 years of prosperity passed. 2 years into the famine is when Israel arrived into Egypt, meaning Joseph was 39. Very important. This means that Joseph was 39 when the 215-year period started. Do you understand? Because again, they sojourned for 215 years. The maximum that they could be in Egypt is 215 years, meaning Joseph, we have another time marker that when that period began of the 215 years, Joseph was 39 based on the 7 years of famine, 7 years of prosperity vision that was being fulfilled. Now, Genesis 50, verse 22. Joseph dies at the age of 110. So Joseph remained in Egypt, and he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. Okay, now we have a timestamp. 110 minus 39 years when Israelites came is 71 years of prosperity under Joseph, where they were not slaves because Joseph was in charge. Do you get it? Joseph was like the grand poobah next to the Pharaoh, and so he was the one managing, and he gave them a nice place. So under Joseph, they prospered. And they prospered even a little bit after Joseph until whatever, these reforms happened through the new king, through the new Pharaoh. So you have 215 years maximum that they could possibly be in Egypt, minus a period of 71 years. Because again, remember, the Israelites came when Joseph was 39 and he died at 110, meaning there's 71 years they enjoyed of not being slaves. They enjoyed actually prosperity. They were high-class citizens. So what do you get? Well, 215 minus 71 is 144 years maximum that they could have been slaves in Egypt. They were not enslaved for 400 years. They weren't enslaved for 430 years. They weren't enslaved for 215 years. The maximum possible that they could have possibly been enslaved is 144 years. However, again, there's more questions to ask. Did they start getting enslaved right away, or did this take like a generation or maybe two? They were the Bible seems to suggest back in Exodus 1, verse 6 through 8, that Joseph dies and then Israel continues to flourish. And eventually the king's like, okay, this is a problem. So to me, that suggests that there's even more time, like maybe a generation, that passes and things start to go south and there's new policies being put into play. So my particular leaning, again, there's no specifics on this, but my guess, if I were to give you an educated guess, would be it's less than 144 years. The period of time that they were enslaved was probably something like 120 years, give or take, let's say 5-10 years, something like that. Either way, it was not 400 years. It wasn't 430 years. It wasn't even 215 years. Now, there's a challenge that comes with this, and that is in Genesis 15, verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. Okay, so people say, you see, they're going to be afflicted, and that proves that they're going to be slaves for 400 years. Well, it doesn't say enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. It gives you a lot of different things. It says they're going to be sojourners, they're going to be servants, they're going to be afflicted in a foreign land for 400 years. Okay, well, Canaan is also a foreign land, and so is Egypt. So this is much more broad than what maybe Talmudic Jews or people who are, very Jewish focused are going to make it. It says Abraham's seed will be enslaved and mistreated in a foreign land not their own. Also, the period is for 400 years, which is a slightly different prophecy than the 430 years. Very interesting. It's not that God is contradicting himself. There's two reckonings that are happening, which is very interesting. The 400-year period is not, it's that they'll have these experiences happening to them. Do you understand? 430 years was the sojourning. 400 years is a prophecy that intersects with that one. It's an intersecting prophecy. Intersects for most of it, but it's a slightly different prophecy. One is about sojourning, which encompasses the sojourning that we just described. The 400 years prophecy is one that deals with also other things that are happening in that time. Sojourners in the land, not their own, servants, and being afflicted. Okay, I wonder what the Septuagint says. Sojourner in the land not their own, they shall enslave them, they shall afflict them, and humble them for 400 years. This is also important. I think this is a better translation. Because they're being humbled, they're being enslaved, they're being afflicted, and they're being sojourners. So there's more going on with this prophecy. It's a little more specific, even though it not overshadows, but intersects with the previous one. So what's going on? Well, you're looking at two different reckonings. In Genesis 21, verse 8 through 9, Ishmael, who is born again before Isaac, is mocking Isaac. And the child grew, this is verse 8 in Genesis 21, and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast in the day that his son Isaac was weaned. And Sarah, having seen the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, who was born to Abram, sporting with Isaac her son, meaning like kind of like, Ishmael was like mocking Isaac. And she said to Abram, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not inherit with my son Isaac. So obviously, sporting here doesn't mean like, hey, they're playing tag. She wouldn't say cast this, woman out with her spawn. She's basically telling Abraham to cast Hagar out with Ishmael because Ishmael is basically mocking and harassing Isaac. The older brother is harassing him. So this is a very important point because if we look at Galatians 4, verse 28 through 29, but that's not in the Septuagint. Hold on. So that's another issue. Sometimes if you're going back to the New Testament and you're on the Septuagint, it won't do it. Verse 28. Now you brothers, like Isaac, are children of the promise. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit. What are we talking about? So also it is now. This was a type and shadow, Ishmael persecuting Isaac and sporting with him. Of course, you don't get the meaning from the Old English sporting, but this is what's happening. Ishmael was giving Isaac a hard time. And that was the beginning of the 400 years. Do you see the brilliance there? This is the brilliance, and you'll see how it all ties together. So Paul appropriates that exact thing, which is that the persecution, this was a type and shadow, and it was prophecy being fulfilled, is that Ishmael persecuted Isaac. Now, notice another important thing. If we go back to Genesis, and the child grew and was weaned. So Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. So when was the persecuting starting to happen? It's when Isaac was weaned. Now, if you study like what is the tradition around that time, children were weaned around 5 years of age, which is very likely. Now, remember a couple things. Isaac was born 25 years after the promise was given to Abraham. Abraham was 75. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years old. So 25 years. Plus another 5 years, if you can see where I'm going with this, is when Isaac was weaned. Meaning 30 years had passed of the 430 years of sojourning prophecy. When the persecuting aspect of the prophecy, the second prophecy of the 400 years, began. Do you understand how incredibly just aligned this is? It's so perfect. It's just truly amazing. So Isaac was being persecuted. He began to get persecuted by Ishmael at his weaning party, probably because Abraham was treating him with favor, and Ishmael was like, oh, look at you, you little girl, or something like that. Who knows? That's when the persecution started. But that was a type and shadow for the people of God being persecuted by those of the flesh and those being of the spirit being persecuted by the flesh. That was designed as a prophecy. Isaac being persecuted as a 5-year-old was a prophetic thing. So that began the 400-year period, which is the period of the persecuting, of being made humble, and all these other things that were described earlier. So, conclusion is that the Masoretic text is wrong about the Israelites' time in Egypt. All the evidence that we've looked at, and of course we looked at historical, scriptural, and so on, aligns with the Septuagint. Remember that the Israelite slavery was maximum 144 years. It cannot be more than that. But again, in my opinion, probably less, like 120 years, give or take 5 or 10 years. The movies are wrong. The modern Bibles are wrong on this. Anyone using gematria with the number 430 as a number for slavery and captivity, they're wrong about this. And again, people have used these things for Bible prophecy. Look, if you do 430 times 3 or this, it comes out like they weren't enslaved for 430 years. So that's wrong. And also, the 400-year objection is not... It's not an objection because the 400-year prophecy is not about being enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. It's a parallel time period that runs with the 430-year period. There are 2 periods of time that are running parallel with each other. One of them is sojourning, and then God gives a more specific prophecy like, look, out of those 430 years would be a way to discern it. 400 of those years, you're going to be... your offspring is going to be humbled and persecuted and enslaved, and afflicted in a foreign land, not their own. Well, was Isaac being humbled and persecuted in a foreign land? Yes, because Ishmael was making fun of him. Then you had, Jacob and Laban, or maybe I'm getting that confused, but maybe it was Isaac, I forget. Anyway, there's always something going on with the people of God of the promise until they got into Egypt. And then Egypt, the whole thing with the slavery happened. So there was always something to happen where they were being either afflicted or humbled in some way. Remember the feast, or not the feast, the famine, the 7 years of famine. 2 years into the famine, they came to Egypt. So they were experiencing famine. They were being afflicted. Usually when the Bible says afflicted, it means fasting. So all these things point to various tribulations that the people of God, Abraham's offspring, had to experience for a period of 400 years. That was parallel to the period of 430 years of them sojourning in a foreign land. So the 400-year thing is not an objection to, the validity of the Septuagint, because it doesn't deal with the same thing. They're two different prophecies. So hopefully you see that. Hopefully I've made that clear. But anyway, now that you have some idea of the problems in the Masoretic text, it's time to unpack a more serious issue, which is the corruption of the biblical timeline. And with that, we are going to go to part 5.